Christopher Dotson. How did you decide that arts and this particular medium was going to be your vocation?
I didn't decide. Originally, I wanted to be a scientist or, I don't know, an engineer or something like that. I wanted to be good at sports. I wanted to be good at school. I wasn't good at either. Obviously, I hurt my toe just playing backyard soccer. But I didn't expect to be. It's just that when I was younger, back in the 70s, it was very different. Where I grew up, there were a lot of trees, there were woods everywhere, and I explored around a lot as a child. I mean, back in those days, I remember my mother would let me just wander, and I would go in the woods to the point where I couldn't see my home when I was 5 years old. And I would turn over rocks and find creatures under there. I would explore around, and so I've always had that. I always had an inquisitive nature. I spent a lot of time just exploring around my home when I was a kid, and I had, this imagination. I've always had an imagination for things, and I've always been very visual. And so I just started drawing as just part of it. I mean, it's just something where, you're going to do it compulsively. Drawing is like a compulsive thing. And that's where it all starts, is making things, building things. And that continued on into when I was, up until now, but it continued on until I was an adolescent, and I continued to build. I grew up with Legos, so I was always building cities and building like space thing, like spaceships and stuff like that. So I was always very creative. I was always designing something or building something. I've always gravitated towards it. It's more, I try to explain to people, it's not really a choice. It's kind of like you're born to do something. And I wanted to be, an all-star football player and really good at math and go to a really good university. But that's not who I really was. And I didn't find this out until probably the end of my high school. I took an art class in high school, and I did really well. In fact, I found an old report card from, I don't know, my 11th grade year, my junior year. And the only A that I had was in art. Everything else was C's, D's, and some F's. I just didn't do very well in school. And then I somehow miraculously made it into a university. And I originally tried to do business. I tried to go for business because that's what my stepfather was telling me was the best options. You go, if you're going to go get a degree in something you can use. And I spent a year just trying to become that person that I thought I should become somebody, like a responsible college student who studied and made good grades. And I almost failed out of college. I got a letter from the university. They were going to, they had me on academic probation because my grades were so dismal. And in order to bring my grades up, I took some electives. One of those electives was a painting class. And I don't know how I got into the class because there were prerequisites, which I didn't have prerequisites for that class. The professor told me that she said, if an art major signs up, you have to leave because you're not an art major. And I don't know how you got in this class. And I said, it's okay. I'm just here so I can make a good grade to bring my grades up. Of course, she didn't like that. She's like, oh, really? We're not just going to hand you an A. This is not how this works. It's okay. So halfway through that class, that semester, I went in for my mid-semester grades, and I had an F and a note with my work that said, come see me. And I went to speak to my professor, and I said, I thought you liked my work. And she said, is that your work? And I said, yes, that's my work. And she said, well, some of the students have accused you of cheating, or they think you're cheating. And I remember thinking, like, how would you cheat? You know, and I asked her, I said, we don't take tests. We only paint. So how am I cheating? And she said, well, you know, they just don't understand how a business major can paint the way you do. And, you know, I did procrastinate. I wasted a lot of time in class. I flirted with a lot of girls. I spent time doing stuff that I shouldn't have, goofing off. And then I would come in after a long weekend with a painting. And it's just that I worked in private. I didn't want to work in the studio. So they couldn't understand, who is this guy? He's not an art major. He's a business major. He's a clown. He goofs off all the time. And then he comes in with a painting, and it's really good. So I had to explain to her that I just am that way. I just procrastinate. I have a lot of bad habits, but that work is mine. And I said, I'll show you. I can show you. If you really want me to, I'll paint in front of you and show you. And she said, no, I've seen you drawing. I know you can do it. And I said, okay, then there shouldn't be a problem, because, you know, these students are maybe jealous. I don't know. After that, and she asked me at that point, she said, well, why are you a business major? And I said, well, that's what my parents wanted. And she said, well, what do you want? I said, well, I really love art. I really like to draw and paint. And she said, well, that's what you should do then. And it was like at that moment, I kind of started to really seriously think about it as a way to have, you know, to make a living. But it took me a long time, a lot of years, to get to the point where I am now. And I wouldn't even say that I'm a career artist. I still don't think of myself that way, because it's been a struggle, mostly a struggle against myself, because, you know, I had ingrained in me, there's nobody in my family who was an artist. So I had no example. I have no person to look up to and go, oh, that's how my uncle did it, or that's how my dad did it. There was nobody in my family who had ever done anything like that. And the generation I grew up in did not have a lot of artists. Artists were thought of as beatniks. They were thought of as losers. They, you know, that's just the way I was brought up. So I had a lot of inner conflict when I was younger. I had a lot of jobs. I had a tech job. I worked for 16 years when I was in the military. I mean, I did all these other things kind of to avoid being who I really was. And then I don't know, I guess at some point I got to a point in my life where I realized that if I couldn't create, I was sick. Like, I had anxiety. I had all these problems that were, you know, related to anxiety. So I just started to just draw and paint from the heart. And I just let go of everything. And I stopped worrying about what my work looked like. I stopped worrying about what people thought. I just got to a point where I decided that, you know, I'm an artist and I'm just going to have to do that come what may. And by letting go, my work has evolved. You know, it's not something, I don't feel like I'm guiding it. I feel like it's guiding me, which is exactly what I want. I want my work to evolve on its own, almost like I'm an observer. My journey has taken me all over the place, and I've done a lot of different things. I mean, like I said, I was in the military. I worked as a computer technician. I was in IT for partially in the military and partially outside of the military for about 16 years. And I didn't like it. Wasn't really ever very good at it. Wasn't into the job. It was just a paycheck. All the while painting and creating on the side, but I always kept it more of a side thing. And even now, I still work full time for an aviation company, a major aviation company, which I don't want to say, and I also run a business on the side. So my goal, and this is moving forward, is just to kind of let everything else fall by the wayside and do nothing but art. But I have responsibilities. I have a mortgage. I have, actually I have 2 mortgages. I have a son that I want to put through college. I have responsibilities, financial responsibilities. It's hard to let go sometimes of reality. And that's what I have to do. To do my art, I have to let go of reality. I have to let go of everything. And I have to forget that I'm even there. That's the only way I've found to create, is just completely give in to the process, completely give in to the materials, and just let things happen. I feel like if I guide the process, if I'm too headstrong, if I'm pushing too hard in a direction, I feel like the work is not as strong. And I look at other artists' work and I see how they're very purposeful. They're going to paint a picture of a church, for example, or they're going to paint a picture of a building, and they're very purposeful. Their work has a certain look to it, and they have a start, a middle, and an end, and it's voila, and the work is done. And I'm very impressed by that. But that's not how I work. I work in steps and stages. Sometimes I'll work furiously for a week at a time and hardly eat or sleep, and then take a few days off. So I don't have a very specific work schedule. I work when I need to mentally. I mean, it does help me mentally. It helps me to, I guess, put things in perspective, but also to wash away things. It's like meditative. It's a meditative practice. It helps me to kind of push everything to the side and forget. I mean, I even forget I'm there. It's kind of hard to explain. The closest thing I can relate it to is meditation, because I do get into kind of a trance where time will go by. And I mean, 8 hours could go by. I haven't eaten. I haven't done anything except work. And I guess that's what I like about it, is I get so into what I'm doing, that I forget myself. And at the end, there's this thing that you can show. You can show your journey. You can show where you've been. And that's what I think is so amazing about artwork. So I think art is more about the process of making it. It's more beneficial to me to make it than for someone else to view it, in my opinion. I mean, some other people, they do get something out of my work, obviously, but for me, the benefit is in the doing of the art. I guess the practice of doing art is what's so important. That's the main thing, is that I'm not looking for, at the end, I'm not looking for this thing that I can show, so much as this is a thing that I did when I was just in this trance, or whatever you may call it. I guess maybe an escape, but I don't know what I would be escaping from. I have a good life. I can't complain, but it is sort of a way of meditating, I guess, is the best way to explain it. And I don't want to get into too many details about, where I've been, where I was in the military. I mean, I did do a lot of scuba diving, because I was in the Coast Guard, and I got into scuba diving when I was about 17 years old. And I had the good fortune to go to, the Bahamas, to go scuba diving, the Virgin Islands. And I went to all these beautiful places. And that had a big impact on me. That had a huge impact on me, seeing the being able to fly, which basically, if you're in clear enough water, you feel like you're flying, and seeing all these beautiful creatures that I'd never seen before, swimming around. And I mean, we saw some of the most amazing things, and we would go on a night dive, and that's just a whole separate thing. That is another world. Diving at night is it's incredible. And luckily, I did get into diving before a lot of the coral diseases. There's a lot of diseases that are wiping out coral now, but I got to see gorgeous coral reefs, the colors, and I mean, I would say that it doesn't have maybe a direct influence on my work, but it is there. It is something that I think about when I'm working sometimes. When I was in college, I was a whitewater rafting guide. I worked on a ski mountain. So I've always been into adventure and those kinds of sports. I guess that's what has shaped my work in a way, is, exploration, the idea of seeing what's out there. I love nature. Nature has always been fascinated with nature. And I'll read biology textbooks and look at the pictures and read the captions and read about it. Even though I don't understand everything about it, I just like the idea that there's stuff out there that we don't understand yet. And then the other side of it too is I really do believe that in the universe there are certain laws that are universal, and those are things that wash through every atom in the entire universe. There are things like gravity, things that are they're universal law. And so when I work now, I try to take curves and lines and shapes from nature, but I don't try to show the visual side of nature so much as the spirit of nature. I try to harness the idea. So I guess I'm not concerned with, if I paint a fish, for example, I'm not concerned with painting a specific type of fish, because that doesn't do me any good. I try to understand the idea of the fish, or I try to understand, what's the quickest way that I can draw a fish and make it still a fish, make it as efficient and as sleek as possible, because that's the way nature works. So I try to work the way I imagine that nature designs things. I guess I can understand the creation, how everything is created, how the universe works. So I guess in a way I have become a scientist, but in my own way, not in the traditional sense. I wouldn't have had the grades to be a scientist, but I do think of myself as a quasi-scientist when I work. And I love color, and in the end of the day, I am very liberal with color. I use color however I feel. If a color works in a certain area, then I don't care if that bird is supposed to be pink or not. It's going to be pink. And I think that's the discretion of the artist too. I did study art in college, and I did learn about a lot of the European artists who were, like Matisse, who were, very, they were innovators. They kind of stood out from the academic realism. And when I was younger and I was trying to paint and draw, I wanted everything to look very realistic. I mean, for years I tried to paint as realistically as possible. And I have made paintings that are very realistic. When I look back on that, I don't get the same emotion out of it as I do my latest work, the newer work that I'm doing now, which is where I'm just allowing myself to be creative and allow the process to pull me through it. So I get much more enjoyment out of what I'm doing now than what I used to do. I can paint realistically, but it is more akin to work for me than just allowing myself to just be free. And that's what art is about to me, is that having that freedom that you don't normally have in life. Art sets you free, it can set you free. So being able to create is in a sense, you escape everything. You escape gravity, you escape convention, you can escape everything, and you can learn. You can learn so much. And so I don't know, I guess that is it in a nutshell, is that, I do my work because sometimes I need an escape. Some people use drugs, some people, they get into whatever their work is, but for me, drawing and painting and being creative is my escape. So that's what I enjoy doing, and it makes me feel, it takes me away from myself and everything else. So I guess I can escape gravity in that way.
Let's stay a little bit longer with your fish paintings and talk about those symbols that you have embedded in your paintings.
Fish themselves, this is going to sound really kind of weird, but when I used to work for this tech company, there were times when I would sit at my desk and I would be bored and I would start doodling. And I remembered something that an art history professor said, and I don't know, I can't remember the exact words, but it's something to the akin that, sometimes an artist's sketches and doodles are more powerful than their grandiose work. And I remember being in this particular class where, he would show an artist's sketch and then he would show the final work, and the sketch would sometimes look more powerful. So I started thinking, I'm doing these very realistic paintings, but what comes out of me naturally are these doodles. And I got caught at work a few times drawing. My manager was not real happy with me sketching while at work, even though I had nothing to do. I took one of these sketches and I had decided that I was going to make a painting of it, just to push that idea further. It was just a little Post-it note, it was little yellow Post-it notes, and it had, a fish drawn with 3 lines in a circle, an arc, a second arc, a line for the tail, and then a circle for the eye. Very simple. And I had overlapped them, so I just quickly drew lines, and then I would create the shading to pull some fish forward, to push some fish back. And so I wanted to create this idea in the painting. I wanted to create this idea of layers, like depth, like I'd seen when I was night diving. And I didn't really want a specific type of fish. I wanted the prototypical fish, the idea of fish, or a thing moving in space, being layered, the idea of space. And so I just painted that first painting, and I can send that to you, but I painted that very first painting, and I had nothing but the shapes. I had the shapes, I had the background, I had everything layered, and there was something else missing, and I thought, oh yeah, the eyes. So I went back in, and when I painted in the eyes, I thought of the eyes as a separate layer. So I had the multiple layers of the fish, with shadows and everything. But then I went back in and I added in as much as I could paint realistically from my imagination, these eyes with, highlights in them. And I thought of the eyes, they say the eyes are the window to the soul. And so I thought of, okay, the eyes will be the third layer. So the observer, we're one layer. That's the way I think about it. The painting itself has multiple layers, and in those layers you have the different fish, but then the eyes they're another layer on top of that, and so they pull you in. The eyes pull you in, but also it's a way to give a kind of a human aspect to the fish. It's a way of expressing another dimension. It's not just shapes, it's not just colors. It's now there's emotion there, and in those eyes, I try to create the sense of emotion. And what I understood from when this whole thing was done was that these fish took on a life of their own. They seemed to be in a hurry, they seemed to be worried, and they seemed to be huddled together. And I kind of thought, well, fish do school like that, and they do that in nature for protection. But people do the same thing. We're very social animals. Dogs do the same thing. So nature has a way of repeating itself. Nature has this way of, there's safety in numbers. In fact, I did a show where the name of the show was Safety in Numbers. I guess it's the idea of repetition. It's the idea of nature sort of having this way about it. And I could read a textbook, but I would only understand it as a scientist would understand it. I wouldn't understand it in a spiritual way. So I think when I draw these quick lines, I do everything very, very quickly. And then I will erase and I'll paint over things and I'll correct. And sometimes I'll rub out the entire drawing. I'll draw on a canvas with vine charcoal. I draw very quickly. And then I'll wash that away on purpose. I wash away a lot of what I do. I rub the painting off completely. And I think it leaves remnants. It leaves a remnant. It leaves some, what you can't completely erase. If you were to write a letter on a piece of paper and you try to erase it, you can still see some of the writing, and then you write over it. And to me, that's fascinating to see those layers. So it's not just the layers, the visual layers, but it's also the idea of layers, and the idea of repetition, and the idea of getting certain shapes that are found in nature. It's kind of a soup, and I'm just sitting there stirring it. As I work, I'm just stirring it. And I work until completion. I don't have a preset notion of what completion is. I work until I get to a point where I just pause and I think, if I put that brush on that canvas one more time, I'll ruin it. And I have ruined them. I've ruined a lot of paintings. I've overpainted. I've gone way past. I've ruined more paintings than I can count. I would say my success rate, in my opinion, is 1 out of 10. So for every really good painting that I do, there's 9 other ones that didn't live, they failed. But I'm getting better. I think I'm getting better at getting something to completion that's successful. And so that's my goal, is to be able to work, to have a method of working that leads the image to success. But that takes time. There's no guide. I have no one showing me, okay, this is how you have to do this. This is how you have to do that. I mean, when I went to school, I studied art. I was an art major, but that was at a university. At no point in time did any professor ever talk about technique like fat over lean, or, I mean, it just, even in the drawing classes, there was nobody that came up beside me and said, okay, I want you to draw it like this. That never happened. Everything was sort of, they let you live and die by your own means. So I've always been my own artist. I've never, and I kind of wish that I had maybe had a background in like academic arts, such as in Florence. Maybe that would have added a new dimension or given me some better methods for working. But I think in the end, I probably would be where I am anyway. So I don't know that it would matter, but I did learn a lot when I was in school for the arts. But most of it was theoretical. I mean, we studied, all of the dead artists. I didn't do art for a few years because I was I thought, well, I'll never be an Andy Warhol. I'll never be a Van Gogh. I don't even know if I wanted to be a Van Gogh, after reading about him. So I love his work, but I mean, I was like, I don't want to end up like that. So there were years that I just didn't paint. I just ignored it. Drew silly things and tucked them into a book somewhere. So I kind of worked against myself, I guess, for years. And, so I think in the last few years, I've sort of rediscovered that childish part of my work, which is the exploration, the idea of, just get out there and explore. And I don't paint in a specific genre. I don't even think of it that way. I try to escape that. If I'm sitting there and I'm like, well, that line looks like something that, I don't know, Rene Magritte would have painted, I'll erase it. Because I don't want that to be my guide. That's not my guide. My guide isn't, I'm interested in other artists' work, but I don't want to copy, and I'm not trying to get from their work. I do get things from other artists, but when I work, I just want it to come out naturally. And I feel like if there's something too recognizable in an image, I'll destroy it just because that's the wrong way. So if I'm going down a path and I start walking down the wrong path and I realize that's not the right path, I'll kind of backtrack and try to get myself back on the right path. The path is always moving and winding. And so I don't ever really know what the wrong path is. So I know it sounds convoluted, but that's the creative process. It is convoluted and confusing, and it's never straightforward. It's never easy, but that's kind of like life too.
How did you come up with this hieroglyphic style?
When I was younger, I used to have a subscription to National Geographic. I read a few articles about the Maya, the Inca, ancient Egypt. In fact, I've got a tattoo of a hieroglyphic on my back, but I've always been fascinated with the art of, I wouldn't even say primitive cultures, because I don't believe those cultures are primitive in the sense that we think they are, but cultures that they used art very directly. It was, art was life was art. There's no distinction. They didn't hang it on a wall. It was part of their life. It was part of who they were. And it was expressive of who they were. And a lot of these cultures will draw an animal, for example. You'll see all four legs. They won't foreshorten the legs like we do in the Western culture, where they'll hide one leg. Like if you're drawing a horse and you hide one leg behind the other, and so you see it looks three-dimensional. It's visually three-dimensional. They'll draw it like that. So there's the idea of visual realism and then realism. And so I'm fascinated by that sort of, that world in between, where you've got visual realism, the idea of a horse looking like a horse. It's got shadowing, it's got highlights, and then you've got a horse that's drawn with all four legs, and it's abstracted to the point that you can't even tell that it's a horse. But then you think, well, they put magic in that. They put spirit in there. They wanted to bring it alive. They didn't want a stagnant image. They wanted something that lived. And so these cultures, that's what I get out of some of these images from these other cultures, especially the Inca. And not so much, they didn't do a lot of painting, but their earthworks. I mean, they did sculpt with stone, but with the way they do it, like the San Blas Indians is one of them. There's a painting that I can show you, or it's not even a painting, it's an actual textile. And the San Blas Indians, they're very creative. And I've always had this image in my family. My grandmother had it. And ever since I was a baby, I stared at this thing. It's just this little woven image of, it looks like a bird. It is a bird. It's got vertical stripes. It's very colorful, because that's what I'm trying to get to the essence of. Is, that relaxed form of creating where you can just, whatever color you want. You want the eye to be red, the eye's red. You want the eye to be green, it's green. It's for the purpose of the artist. I guess the hieroglyphics came about because I wasn't trying to write specifically like hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics are a form of writing. So if you look at Egyptian hieroglyphics, they're not just pictures of birds and stuff, although that's how I see them because I don't know how to read them. So when I look at hieroglyphics, I don't know what they say. I just like the images. I borrowed from that. And when I do a picture of a bird, I try to make it, so I'll make an image of a bird, let's say, and I try to make it as simple as possible. And sometimes I'll make it a solid color. And sometimes I'll put a little bit of shading in there. And then sometimes I think, well, is it a bird or is it a plant? Is this object, what is it? And that comes from when I was a kid and I was out in the woods and I would look at something and not have a context for it. I wouldn't understand what it was, what I was looking at. And it could be like a bird, perched a certain way, or an owl on a tree or whatever. And I had no knowledge of what that was. I had no name for it. So it's just this thing. And it's ambiguous in a way. And it blends in sometimes with its environment and it becomes part of its environment. And so there's that idea too, where, is it a bird? Is it a plant? And I'm fascinated with how, looking at hieroglyphics, I can't figure them out. And so I guess I try to recreate that, where I can't figure it out. I want it to be ambiguous. I want it to be, where it could be transitional. It could be something that's becoming something else. It could be you're looking at it wrong. It could be that, okay, maybe it is a plant, but it doesn't really look like a plant, but it resembles a plant. It's close enough. And it really isn't even about that's a plant, that's a bird. It's more about the ideas of the shapes and the colors. You're supposed to be taken away and brought into that world where they're symbols in a way. But then are they? And I know this is all kind of confusing because it's confusing to me too, but that's what keeps me coming back to it. Is if I feel like if I had a complete understanding of what I was doing, I would stop doing it. And that's just my nature, is just, if I understand something too much, I move on. So I need something that is silly, that I view as nonsensical, and I don't take it too seriously. And in a way, now it has become very serious because I look at the work afterwards and I think those symbols are so ambiguous. I come up with them off the top of my head, but then they're very practiced. They're very repetitive. They're very practiced, and I insist certain things. So I insist certain shapes. Certain things are insisted. They may be a different size here or there. They may be a different color here or there, but the shape, the curvature of those lines is very insisted. So that is the part where I think I'm trying to harness nature. I'm trying to harness the idea of nature. And so there is ambiguosity in nature. I mean, things can look a different way depending on how you look at them. And I try to think about other planets. Is there life on other planets? And would it adhere to the same laws that our life here on Earth adheres to? I mean, I guess it would have to do with gravity. And I'll sit there and think about things like that. If there was life on another planet, would it be very similar to what we have here? Universal laws really are universal. Wouldn't life on other planets, depending on chance, be very similar? And so I guess maybe, life is chance. So there's that. That's brought into it as well.
You also did series on marbles.
When I was a kid, my grandmother, she collected marbles. And I was given this coffee can full of these marbles. And I had just started a new job that I didn't like, of course. And in order to keep my sanity, every day I would paint. I had this, I had these canvases and I would paint one marble. This is when I was still doing, and I still will go back to realism, and I'll explain why in a minute. But the marbles were the eyes for the fish. I don't know if that makes sense, but as I'm learning, I learn from realism so that I can bring it into my fantasy. So I do still lifes. Sometimes I don't show them, I don't sell them, but they're just for my own information. So I learn about shadow, reflection. I learn about light, how it will change, the temperature of colors, things like that. All the technical things I learn from doing those types of paintings. And then I bring those in part to my abstract work or my hieroglyphic work. But I've had a lot of people, I had one person actually use the word charlatan, which it hurt my feelings at first because, they said, well, you're doing all these different types of work. Some people would say that you're a charlatan. I don't know why they made that comment, but I didn't respond to it because I didn't know how to. And I wasn't even sure if they were right or not, but I don't know. I'm fascinated by marbles, so I paint them. I don't really look that much further into it. It's just a beautiful thing. I'm fascinated. I used to hold the marbles up very close to my eye and look in them and twirl them around and imagine like a universe in there. And I did a painting called Different Worlds where it was a bunch of marbles, and I was fascinated by the way that light would refract through one marble and hit another, and the light would reflect and refract, and that was just fascinating to me, is that quality of light. And I thought to myself, I'm like, these are marbles that my grandmother gave me, and I've always wanted to do an art project with them, but I didn't want to destroy them. I wanted to keep them intact, and so I thought, well, I'll make a painting of these marbles. And I made a few, and I may do another one because they do sell. One just sold in the gallery, and I was pretty surprised, actually. I don't know why I'm surprised by that selling, because I feel like that's not my best work, but I understand why people like it. And ultimately, if you're going to make a living as an artist, at some point you have to sometimes do things that people like. I'm trying to guide people to my newest work, and hopefully they can see what I see in it. But the marbles were a way, I believe it or not, painting helps me keep my sanity, whether I'm painting this or that. But I would paint one marble per day. That was my goal. So I'd come home after this very stressful job. I'd be bone tired. I mean, very, very tired. And I worked a second shift job. So I would usually paint in the mornings, and I would use a roll of tape for the different size. I would just draw a circle to, start the marble. And then I would look at a photograph of whatever marble I wanted to place there, and I would paint the marble. And then I would try to imagine how the light was refracting and reflecting. And sometimes I would group them in the photograph so I'd have that reference. Ultimately, it came out better than expected. Sometimes I surprise myself that I'm able to paint. So I guess I've learned a thing or two. Those marbles kind of are almost like the fish in a way, in that they have these curves and they have this light. And what I learned from painting a still life, I take to my other work so that I can bring a little bit of realism in it, just enough. Sometimes I don't want any there. Sometimes I want the image to be flat. But it just depends on my whim. It just depends on what I'm feeling like at that time. There's no rhyme or reason to it. Like I said, if I had a reason for doing a painting, I wouldn't do the painting.
You are doing drawings using graphite and charcoal?
Yes. I love fine charcoal, especially on a canvas, because, I can use water, brushes. I can blend it with my hand. I can almost completely erase it. Not complete. That's what I like about it. It doesn't completely erase. It doesn't ever completely go away. So there's always this record of it. If I'm going to do a painting and I use graphite, you have to remember that as long as it's an oil painting, it's okay. Nothing sticks to graphite. But if you're using solvents and you're using, oil paint, it will wash away the graphite. In fact, that graphite will blend in with the paint itself and will become part of it. But graphite is used as a lubricant. I mean, they use for locks and stuff like that. Graphite itself is a lubricant. So I try to shy away from using too much graphite in a drawing if I'm going to go over it with paint. Because if you were to take a pencil and you rub it, and fill up just a section of paper, you can actually put a drop of water on that and it will roll right off because it's a lubricant. They sell powdered graphite and you squirt it into a lock and that lubricates the lock. So I try to think of it like, if I'm going to go into a painting, I now am more inclined to use vine charcoal because vine charcoal it blends very readily with paint, either acrylic or oil.
You said you had a piece here that is not at the gallery.
Did you have it? Thanks. I've got a whole shelf over here full of little knickknacks, things I collect from the beach. So when I walk on the beach, I love to collect shells because I just like the abstract shapes. They almost look like sculptures and stuff like that. And I am going to start doing some sculptures. But anyway, I wanted to show this first. So I cut a postcard. I cut the postcard image, which was the painting. This was my very first fish painting. And I cut the image out and I mounted it on a piece of wood here, masonite. And then I poured epoxy resin over it, and it came out looking pretty good. But anyway, this is just something I did for me. I had planned to do more of these, but it was pretty labor intensive to get it perfect. So that was my very first fish painting, and I'll send you that image. That one actually was very popular. That was the very first moment where I realized, okay, I could do these. These look good. But this is something that I was talking about with the hieroglyphics here. This is a multi-layer image on masonite. And this has, when I say multi-layer, there's painting on the surface of the panel, then a layer of epoxy, and then more paint, and then another layer of epoxy, and then more paint, and then another layer of epoxy. And so the epoxy is kind of built up to a certain thickness here. I don't know if you can see that, but anyway, so it's a multi-layered, and it probably doesn't show up that well on camera, but it's a multi-layered image with a lot of the different symbols. So here, for example, that's a plant. That's obviously a bird, an upside down bird. I think that's a trident, an eye with a tear, a star with a drop in the middle of it. Perhaps that's rain. This could be the moon or a bird. So that, an upside down plant here, that's the symbol for a plant. And then oftentimes I will put a drop coming out of the plant. I don't know if this is clear to you, and then, so I'm fascinated with drops. I've done sculptures of drops. I have in my bathroom I redid my bathroom with these sculptures that I made. I made molds for them and I repeated the shapes over and over. But anyway, I kind of almost see these as like a celebration of color and shape and design. And they might tell a story. I mean, there's no specific story. There's not like you could read this and go, oh, that's what he's trying to say, because I'm not a writer. If I was a writer, I would do more writing like my sister does. That's kind of what I'm talking about with the hieroglyphics. This piece didn't go in the show mainly because I couldn't find a frame for it in time. And I have this one, but this is something that I found on the side of the road. So that's what it looks like with the frame on it. But I can't, I want to glue it in here. So it doesn't really stick. So I have to find a way to mount that in there, maybe using metal clips or something. That's when I broke my toe. So I got to a certain point where I was creating work for the show and I couldn't work anymore. I was hobbling around, like rolling around on the ground trying to do my paintings. And I did as much as I could for the show until I got to the point where I just physically couldn't do any more. And then kind of went back to my sketchbook. So I rely on my sketchbook as I don't know, a way to fill in the time. You know, if I'm not painting, I'll always be sketching. I'm always drawing something, sketching something. I try to stick to the basics. So I like to have, of course, a black and a white, but sometimes I found out about this, it's called the Zorn palette, or they call it the Zorn palette, where you use white, black, and then like a cadmium red and a yellow ochre. Very simple. And with that, you can get a lot. You can get so many colors out of that. I use a modified version of that, which is I will have a white and a black, and then I'll have a warm red and a cool red, a warm blue and a cool blue, and then a yellow. And I like to have ochre as well. So I think of my ochre as my warm yellow and my yellow as my cool yellow. So it's like a primary yellow is actually a cool color. So I like to have, when I have color, I like to have the basic colors, but I like to have a cool version and a warm version of that color. Nuts. It doesn't have to be as specific. It doesn't have to be cobalt blue or ultramarine. Ultramarine is like a cool blue, and cerulean would be like a warm blue. I don't know if that's technically right, but that's the way I think of it. But that's, and I'm not unique in that. I mean, I don't think my palette is really very unique. It's a bit messy. I'm not nearly as organized as other artists. I watch other artists on YouTube, and they just have these ways of blending, and they're so organized. They'll have all the colors laid out across, and they'll take a palette knife and they'll mix. I'm a complete wreck. I'm a train wreck when I mix color. I saw an image of Francis Bacon's studio one time, and I thought, okay, he's messier than me. Now I feel okay. My studio will end up looking like a hurricane hit. You know, in the end, there's papers everywhere. There's mess. I spill stuff. I don't do it intentionally. I'm not trying to be messy. It's just I don't think about it. If I need a cool blue, I mix up a cool blue, and I'll mix it on the top of a paint can or whatever I have at hand. I'll mix it up on a plate. I'll mix it up on whatever. I try to be more organized. I'm trying to have better studio practices, but in the end, I'm just a messy painter. And the only thing I can tell you that's constant is that I always have a warm and a cool version of each color. I try to refrain from using black too much. I like to mix up a dark, very, very dark red, or a very, very dark blue, or very, very dark green. And I'll do that by mixing, say, I have like a dark green that I will mix with like a alizarin crimson, and it'll almost look like black, but it's not black. There's color in that. I use black when necessary. When I feel like there's nothing else, I have to use like a Mars black or something like that. But I do use black quite often, but not. I try to refrain from it all the time. So that's basically my palette.
And your tools are mostly brushes, or are you also using palette knives?
Mostly brushes, but the last few paintings I did on panel, I used where I cover the entire panel with like a painter's tape, like the blue tape you would, mask around like a, window or something like that. I cover it with all that, and then I draw on it. And then I take a razor knife and I cut out those shapes. And then I take a palette knife or a brush with a premixed color, and I just completely coat right across that. And I do different colors in the different openings in the tape. And then when it's kind of a little bit dry, not completely dry, but a little bit dry, I pull the tape off. And then it leaves these very neat, sharp edges around each shape. I've just started doing that recently. So that is a technique that I've brought. I saw an artist doing that on YouTube, and I thought, okay, that might be a way for me to do these more quickly to get the sharp edges that I want. And then not only that, but if you can make the paint very thick, and then it has almost a microscopic raised edge. When that's dry, I can sand it, and some of the color will come off, and then I can wash another color back on, and it adds a little bit of a dimension there. That's just one other technique. I don't have very specific techniques. I've thought about getting into airbrush. I just never have. I'm just so comfortable holding a brush, because I have for so long, that it's second nature to me to draw with a brush or a pencil. It's just so comfortable for me. And I think, why reinvent the wheel? I mean, brushes have been used for hundreds and hundreds of years for a reason. I think actually thousands of years.
You have a series on portraits?
I do have a very small series. The portraits that I do are always intimate. They're people that I know. I have tried to do portraits professionally, but people always want me to work from photograph. And for whatever reason, if I work from photograph, it doesn't look right. It's almost like I have to work while looking at the person. At least I have to do numerous sketches, and most people don't have time for that. So I just don't do portraits anymore. This is a self-portrait I did many, many moons ago. I kind of look the same. I was a little bit younger. Anyway, but that was just staring at myself in a mirror. And this one is a portrait of my son. And we have this frame came from Brazil. My wife's, well, actually, it's near where my wife is from. This is a portrait of my son sleeping. And this frame was handmade in Brazil, and we bought it in a city called Olinda. And Olinda it's gorgeous. It's like a hill, and very beautiful city. But anyway, so I painted this when my son was, I guess he was probably about 4, 5 years old, and he was sleeping, and I was able to kind of look at him for a long time as he was sleeping there. And so when I do my portraits, I feel like I do better work when I'm looking at the person. I'm no John Singer Sargent. I wouldn't ever compare myself to him, but I do study his technique. I don't know if I've learned anything from just looking at his work, but if I could paint like John Singer Sargent, I'd be a whole different artist. I would be a portrait artist, but it's not in the cards for me. So I paint the way that I paint out of, I guess, necessity and then my level of skill. I don't think that I'm necessarily the best skilled artist. I think I have unique ideas, but I think my skills are probably on par with anyone else who's been painting for, 38 years or whatever. I mean, I guess if you do something long enough, you get really, really good at it. If you just keep with something, if you keep doing something, you get better and better. I'm sure that if I just dedicated to doing portraits, I would get better at it. Portraits they're very personal. And so you would need to find a client that wants their portrait done. And so it can be kind of a tough game. So I don't know I know one portrait artist. He refers to himself as a portrait artist, but he does other things because finding that client that's going to be able to pay you for the time and the materials and everything else is kind of tough. So when I do portraits, they're of friends and family. Hi, my name is Christopher Dotson. I'm an artist, and my artwork is featured here at the Park Circle Gallery in North Charleston, South Carolina. I have my work featured in other places. I have a one-man show here for the month of May in 2023. I'm going to walk around and talk about a few of the pieces and what my inspiration was for some of them.
Hi, I'm Mariah. I work with North Charleston Cultural Arts Department. Chris Dotson was the poster design winner for our annual North Charleston Arts Fest.
So this is one of my pieces that it's on panel. It's painted using my tape method, where I actually tape the entire surface. I draw out each shape, and then I cut it out with a razor knife, and then I select the colors, and then I go back in and I paint the white in. Once that's done, I go back with an epoxy layer to make the colors come out, and it makes it kind of seem like like a piece of jewelry almost. I wanted the colors to be really, really bright, and I wanted them to kind of be almost flashy. I have, I think, 6 pieces, maybe 7 pieces in the show that are like this. We're using this method. It's kind of new to me, but I'm always experimenting to try and figure out new ways of working. And the title of this piece is Meditation, and then I put the date. The reason I don't really have a title for it, because it's a continuation of the same theme. So it's just a way of meditating. And so I just call it meditation. This is meditation April 20th to the 21st. So this took me 2 days to create, and that's why I named it that. Over here is a canvas that I have been working on. I really couldn't tell you if it's finished. It's someplace in its life cycle. I was listening to a song, and a part of the lyric in the song was, "One day everything you know will change." And I thought that's kind of fitting, because I keep working on this painting and it keeps changing. So this is an evolving work here, and it's acrylic on canvas, and it is a 30-inch by 40-inch. So I couldn't tell you the specific influence for that, other than natural forms and, you know, the idea of the jungle, the forest, and the life that exists in it. I wanted to just completely be free to give my interpretation. It's a bird of prey that's killed a fish, and there's a snake intertwined here. There are trees. That's a bone, a broken bone, which is kind of funny because I recently broke my toe. So it's kind of fitting. This piece didn't really have a direction and still doesn't. I would say it's the only one that's still a work in progress. So over here we have, this one's called Supernatural. I painted this, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. Same thing. I wasn't sure exactly what I was going for. I really just wanted to incorporate the shapes and the colors. I wanted to bring in some of my fish, and I wanted to combine it with birds. And then I wanted in the background, I wanted it to kind of be ambiguous. Is this underwater, or is this in the forest? I wanted that ambiguosity. I just like the idea of a lot of movement and organic forms. And this painting was included, although I haven't seen it, it was in a show called Outer Banks. They did borrow it to shoot some of their episodes, but I haven't seen it. So that's my official disclaimer. I have not seen this on the show yet. Over here, this is the very first epoxy painting that I did, and it's not epoxy paint, but it's acrylic paint covered with epoxy. There's 2 layers of paint, or 3 layers of paint, 2 layers of epoxy on this one. It was originally, and it is intended to be a self-portrait, and I used some of the same techniques that I did with the meditation piece over there, but this is more brush stroke involved. And I believe this one is a 20 by 30. It's called Speakeasy. Over here, this piece is, this piece was originally not supposed to be anything but experimentation. I actually originally used this piece of canvas to clean my brushes. I had it while I was working on another canvas. I had it on the floor, and I would, clean my brushes. So this is an oil on canvas. I went back in and finished the pattern in the background, and then I drew the drawing in front of it. And then I added in some other details like the eyes. But this one is cerulean blue birds, mainly because that's cerulean blue. So I did a series of serving trays as well, using the same techniques as the meditation pieces. These are functional trays. They can be used. So basically I paint the paint on the raw wood, and then I go over that with the epoxy. And so very bright and colorful and playful. It's here in the South, in Charleston, it's very bright, and it's very warm and subtropical. So we do get a lot of sun, and I think that's played into the colors. Also, I think, at least partially, these shapes are influenced by growing up in the 1970s and the 1980s, and we had something called the mid-century modern furniture and art in my house when I was growing up. So I think that had an influence on me. This is an older piece. This is a watercolor piece, hand painted. And I called it the fisherman's net because I kind of, when I was in the Coast Guard, I remember we used to do fisheries boardings, and you know, they'd haul up the nets, and there would just be all of these different fish that would flop out on the deck. I was doing boardings, and we would go on these fishermen's vessels, and when they would pull the catch up, you know, all of these fish and different life forms would just flop out on the deck, and they would all be wiggling, and they were all kind of different shapes and things like that. And I think that kind of stuck with me. So I called this one Fisherman's Net. This piece here is on loan from the Mary Martin Gallery in Charleston. This is another continuation of my nature garden pieces, but this is raindrops in the garden. And I kind of incorporated a lot of different types of animal forms, birds and snakes, and I believe there's a fish or two in there. Also, of course, the raindrops. This one was originally intended to be black and white, but I felt that I wanted to have some color, so I was very conservative with the color. And I wanted to have something on the blue side of the color spectrum. So I focused mostly on blues and teals. Wanted to also have a little bit of a realistic dimension with the raindrops. So I wanted to have some refraction and reflection of light. And overall, I just want the feeling of nature. I want to imbue the canvas with that. This painting over here is called Backwash. Don't ask me why I called it that, but that's the name that stuck. This is an older canvas. Once again, this was not intended to be a painting. I think it was a drop cloth, and it was a mess. And then I stretched it one day, and I thought, let me see what I can make with this. And so a lot of times I start with chaos. And I like taking chaos and reining it in and trying to control it, but then also harnessing that chaos. And I think that's what this piece is about, is kind of harnessing my own chaotic thoughts. And this is, I believe this is a 20 by 30. These over here, and I hope I'm not going too fast. These are meditation pieces. I did one per day. These are the same principle behind the other meditation piece, and these are all meditation April 15th, April 16th, 17th, and 19th. All of these were done back to back in quick succession. I tried to, once I get into something, I try to take it as far as I can take it. This is the winning piece. This is what got me the show here at the gallery. I entered in the competition, and this won the North Charleston Arts Fest poster design competition. And I just called it Forms in a Landscape because I really didn't have another way to describe it. And I don't really like to give titles to pieces sometimes. Sometimes I like them to kind of speak on their own. But same thing where, you know, basically I created these almost hieroglyphic forms. They're not intended to be hieroglyphics. I don't read hieroglyphics. I just like the idea of the pops of color, and each piece, each little component being related to all the other components around it, and they form a greater whole, kind of like in nature. So, you know, some forms are plants, some forms are raindrops, some forms are a hybrid of maybe a bird and a plant, such as these two. And so I kind of see nature as allowing me, you know, to be a little bit ambiguous with my forms. Let's see, here's another tray. This was part of the tray series that I did. This piece is called Bluebirds. It's probably not the best title. I will admit that my titles sometimes are lacking, because to me, everything that I need to say is in the painting. It's not in the wording. I'm not a writer, so I don't think in that way. I think images and shapes and colors. But this is another tray. I do not build the trays. I usually find them. I'll find them either at a secondhand store, somebody will give them to me, and I will try to add my designs, and then I cover the base of the tray with epoxy so that it protects the painting, and also it becomes a functional work of art. This painting here started off orientated where the right-hand side was the top of the painting. And it originally it was, if you can imagine, the fish were swimming. I moved it in my studio. I had moved it off to the side and I tilted it up on its side. And I guess one day I walked in and I thought, I like that. I like the way that that looks better than having it orientated horizontally. So I don't know, one day I decided, you know what, I'm going to see what I can do with this piece. And I drew the hieroglyphic forms on top of the painting. My idea was that if this doesn't work out, I'll just paint over it completely. But I liked the way that it turned out. And I even added in, you know, I made sure that the eyes would line up in some cases. So the eye of the fish is also the eye of the bird. And I don't know, I don't have a specific reason for it, but, you know, I like the way that it looked. And really, that's all I need. I just need something that sparks up a conversation with me. You know, just something that I can work on that kind of helps me to work my way through it. It's got to speak to me somehow. So this is one of my favorite pieces. If it doesn't sell, it's definitely going back in my house. Here we have another tray. I call this one Prototype because it was the very first one that I ever made. I learned some things. I learned some things about epoxy and how epoxy can sometimes cause the colors to bleed. So this was the very first one I did. I learned a lot off of this, and that's why it looks a little bit different, but it still turned out very well. It's a tray that my wife found. I think somebody was giving it away, and she brought it to me, and I was able to make that out of it. This one, I think we called it Pink Sunset, for lack of a better word. Really just playing with color and shape and form and movement. Movement was very important. And I don't know why I chose the bubble gum colored background, but it just seemed to be, sometimes I do things because it's a smart aleck thing to do. Originally, I would have left the background white, but sometimes I will try to do things that, you know, to challenge myself, to challenge my idea. Should the background be white? Maybe it should be pink. So I just went with it. I have one piece over here that's older. This piece is probably the original. That's the original one. That's the very first way that I worked with those types of forms, those curves. And it's a watercolor on paper. And I would say that that was the grandfather of all of them. That's the very, very first one. That's where I broke from reality and started working out what I was doing. I had no idea what I was doing or why I was doing it. And everything has kind of evolved from that painting. So this one, this is probably one of my favorites as well. This piece, I had no idea. I had no idea about the outcome. I was completely flying blind. I used my technique where I used tape and I cut out the individual shapes. And then I painted it white. So it was just plain wood, if you can imagine, with white. And then I had the idea of staining each individual form a different color, but then unifying that with green, because green is, I wanted an emerald green, like the forest, like deep in the forest at night. So these darker parts are not black. It's actually a very, very, very deep green mixed with a very, very deep red. And it appears as very black, but it's not. It's actually just a very extremely dark reddish green. And then there were other places where I let the light come through. And I would say that I was definitely influenced on this one by Paul Klee. Paul Klee was an instructor at the Bauhaus, and I've always loved his work. And a lot of times when I'll see an artist, I won't know what time they existed, and I just like their work. For example, Francis Bacon is one of my favorite artists, and I remember the first time I ever saw a Francis Bacon painting, I was absolutely captivated, and I couldn't look away from it. And I had no idea who he was or when it was painted, and I don't care. If I like something, I don't care when it was created. But I would say that a lot of Paul Klee's paintings and his theories about color and design, they intrigue me, and I try to incorporate that in my work. And this is definitely influenced by some of his works. And I can try and send you this specific painting. I know exactly which one it is that influenced this work. I can't remember the name of it. Again, I don't remember names very well, but I remember images very well. So, and this one is covered with epoxy. It's a layer of epoxy over the paint. But that epoxy brings those colors out. It really brings the colors out, and it makes it almost like a gem, like it shines like a jewel. That's how I imagine it. I've created some other things while working with the epoxy. I created these coasters where I sandwiched in, the paint is in between the layers of epoxy, so it won't come off. I got a couple of these for the show. And this piece right here is pretty interesting. It's very strange. This is actually a three-dimensional piece. This is taking the forms and bringing them into, I guess, a relief sculpture. So I made molds for all these. I actually sculpted these with clay, and then I would make a mold. And then from that mold, I was able to pour the epoxy in. And then I lay the pieces down on top of a board. And then I pour epoxy around them to kind of adhere them to the board. So that's the effect. I chose not to use color with these because this is a sort of experimental piece. And if it didn't go well, I wouldn't have used too much of my color. So, and then we have another small piece here, which is, this was, I didn't know how this was going to turn out. This was an idea I had while I was at work, actually, and I sketched it out, and I went home and immediately painted it. And it is just painted on masonite, and painted on a piece of scrap masonite I had in my studio. And that's why it looks like a hot mess on the back. But anyway, so that's the final piece, unless we look at these pieces over here. I have a few watercolor pieces that are original. And I put these behind a kind of a cellophane. These are a continuation of that, the hieroglyphic pieces here. This one's interesting. This one, I went back in and I worked with pencil to create shading, and I created one big drop, like a dewdrop, sitting resting on top of it. And they kind of, if you look at it from a distance, it does look like a drop of water. So there's the illusion of reality over the, I would say, non-realistic hieroglyphics. I like mixing up reality with things that are abstract.
long is this show?
This show hangs for 1 month. This show, it hangs for 1 month. I will be taking it down at the end of May, and some of the pieces have sold, so those will be going home with individuals, and then some of them may go back to the gallery. Some will probably go to my house, and I will put most of them online on dotsonart.com, and may put a few on Instagram if I didn't originally put them there. I like to use social media to sell my work, but again, some of it sells in the gallery. The stuff that's in the gallery, for the most part, is not here. It's not represented here, but it is sort of similar. That's pretty much it. That's the whole show. I was able to get a lot of these done even after surgery. I had to have surgery on my toe, and I was still able to get a lot of these done, but it was a challenge.